Hey everyone, welcome to this month's sex stream. As you can see, Nicole and Catherine are not with us today, and I am also going to be doing very little talking today because it's all about the mans. We are going to be joined by DeadmanAnimations as well, but they are just running a little bit late. So we're going to just get started with Mike and Jacob, and I'll let them introduce themselves, but we'll get started with them and then we will bring Deadman in whenever they are ready to join. So I'm very excited about this stream because, as you know, on this channel, we usually approach things from, a woman's perspective or an AFAB genderqueer perspective. But we've been getting some requests to hear from people who are men and people who are socialized as men, particularly around, sex and socialization, but also how they've been doing the work to kind of work through their socialization and their conditioning, and divest from the patriarchy and just have better relationships. So that is what we're going to do here today. So I will let you both introduce yourselves. Jacob, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. I'm Jacob. I'm Max's fiance. I don't produce content, so I don't really have something like that I can point people to. But I'm doing a master's program in social work right now, and my area of research is in de-radicalization of white supremacists, particularly.
Yeah.
All right. And I'm Mike. I'm an educator and have been for the past 15 years. Very recently, actually have become a bit of a sex educator as well, which is not nearly as sexy as it sounds, but has definitely been a big part of my journey. So I'm kind of coming from that perspective as an educator as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So I have some kind of guiding questions, but obviously this can be really conversational. You guys can take it, in whatever direction that you want. But the first couple questions, I might combine them because they kind of go together. So how are you taught to think about sex growing up? And then also, how did your peers talk about sex and sexuality and women amongst, yourselves? So you can answer that as one question or combine the two or whatever. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
I feel like we're gonna have very different backgrounds on this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You want to take it away, Jacob? You have something brewing?
I don't know. I feel like it's going to be boring compared to yours, because I know a bit about your background already. But yeah, I mean, I was raised secular. Sex wasn't. I mean, my parents weren't anti-sex and they weren't pro. It just it wasn't really a topic of conversation ever in the house. I remember when I was quite young, maybe 4 or 5, somewhere in that range, my mom got me an educational book for really young kids about what sex is, one of those super introductory, really cute kids books along the lines of there's that, why do we poop, like that sort of thing. Yeah. And my education in the topic of sex, if we can even call it that, came through peer discussions, which were quite bad, obviously, because my peers were also young and we didn't know, no one knew anything about it. We knew snippets of what our parents said, and then what was said in films and TV, which is all just crappy depictions of it. And this is the 90s, so popular depictions of romance and sex were they're still not good, but it's freaky for me to say 30 years ago, but it was 30 years ago. They were even worse. So yeah, my memory around that age is actually pretty hazy. I mostly was just playing video games. So yeah, I mean, I think I had what could be considered for the time a pretty normal or regular exposure to the ideas, even though they were problematic, to the ideas of sex, just through peers. there's more I want to say about you know, how as boys like come of age, like come into the preteens and teens, like how the conversation around sex shifts at that age, in my experience, in really problematic, horrible ways. But like we can get into that later. Why don't we hear from you?
I'll jump in there. That's actually a perfect thought, because I had that same thought as well. There's almost like a point in your life as you know, as a boy, where suddenly something shifts. You know, I was in a weird position in terms. I was taught definitely not to think about sex, and taught that I did not have asexuality. In essence, that because anything outside of being like, you know, a cisgendered heterosexual man was completely inappropriate. But I was raised as a conservative evangelical Christian in the United States at a time that is marked by a lot of like purity culture and this kind of thing. If you don't know what that is and you hate yourself, you can Google that and waste an afternoon. But at the same time, my family was not wealthy, and so, you know, I went to public school and lived in a neighborhood with a bunch of people who were not that same religious tradition. And so I had this weird kind of dual upbringing in terms of sexuality, where I had, like, you know, the neighbor who, you know, who like, you know, showed me his dad's Playboy magazines and like asked me if I knew what vaginas were, you know, this kind of thing. And then contrasted with this extraordinarily repressed kind of home environment in which you don't talk about sex or sexuality really at all. And that sex in particular was an extremely private thing. Mostly sex was wrong. And I jotted down a couple notes: masturbation, homosexuality, sex outside of marriage. All of these things were sin. And in evangelical tradition, at least from my certain perspective, those somehow were like worse sins than other sins. I haven't been able to quite suss this out, but basically, like, sexual sins were somehow like extra emphasized, and even our thoughts around sex were policed. You know, that there's this verse in the New Testament that to look upon a woman with lust is to commit adultery with her in your heart, and these kinds of this kind of policing. So and at the same time, I was an incredibly horny young man. And so I had this kind of weird sort of like, you know, I thought that sex was something that was really cool. It seemed like it was awesome, but I definitely knew nothing about it and could know nothing about it. But at the same time, I was around people, you know, like other people who were like more, I mean, normal, whatever that means, who kind of knew some stuff. And exactly as Jacob said, none of those conversations were good or profitable with my peers. Obviously, was not having those conversations with my parents or my two older brothers. So it was kind of like, okay, well, you know, this is the neighborhood is where I'm going to learn, and school, you know, on the playground is where I'm going to learn about these things.
Yeah, that must have been so hard, like to navigate those two spaces at once. But yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. So yeah, I guess the next part was maybe you can talk about, as you were saying, how that conversation kind of shifts at that certain age, and then how your peers were talking about sex, sexuality, and women in particular around, I guess the age. I mean, one of the questions as well is that, you know, and you kind of touched on it, like how young were you when you were first exposed to porn? Because I know that, like, it's a very, you know, I guess cliche cultural thing in our society that, you know, adolescent, even pre-adolescent boys in particular, there's a huge culture around them consuming porn, and not so much young women, although it's probably changing because of the internet. But still, you know, the culture is very much, you know, that way, and kind of inculcating the male gaze. So yeah, I guess talk about of that age, and you know, what started to happen, and how your conversation started to shift.
The shift. Yeah, it's real. I guess I'll go first. I mean, I'll talk about porn in a minute, but the first thing I want to say is like what happens around that age. And you know, I don't want to claim that my experience is universal, but like I haven't really encountered very many people who what I'm about to explain won't know what I'm talking about. But basically, okay, so around like 13, 14, people start dating in like the way that 13 and 14-year-olds do, where it's like, you know, it's
Holding hands.
like it's weird, it's holding hands. But inevitably you have situations where people start experimenting sexually, right? So what happens then in male friend groups is like whoever like achieves that first is like put on a pedestal. And because they come into patriarchy first, right, in a sense, and then everyone else is made to feel like shit compared to them. And then we're like young boys, right, of this age, like grade 7, 8, 9, 10, like around there. There's a metric ton of peer pressure to be like those boys who
have a lot of sex,
who have sex, basically. And they're like the cool kids. Everyone's made to feel like crap compared to them. And it's like extremely powerful peer pressure and like pure propaganda. Yeah. I mean, that was I had like one friend in particular who was like constantly bragging about the sex he was having. And actually I later discovered that in order for him to lose his virginity at age 16, his mother lied about his age to his girlfriend's parents because she was 18 and they didn't know. Like, I don't even know how this happened. So like she was even like you know, inculcated in this, right? Like what's the word I'm looking for? Implicated. Thank you.
It's really weird.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I want to like actually reference something you just said, Jacob, too, that's really important, is that not only are we like, I like how you said that's like the race to be in patriarchy, you know, it's like the race to get there first. And we're also taught to perform the act of being the type of person who would be, you know, good in that system.
Right.
So like you had mentioned before, like that you were, you know, playing video games as a kid and stuff too. I feel like even the media that we were fed gave this image of what we were supposed to be like a good man or like, you know, a desirable mate in that system. And it was like, you know, the protector, provider, domineering sort of asshole.
Also stoicism. Yeah. Being an asshole,
you have
never
no
expressing emotions.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
So I just want to acknowledge that DeadmanAnimations has joined the stream. So hey, Deadman, it's so great to have you.
Hey, sorry to be late.
No worries.
Problem. Glad you're here.
Yeah. So do you want to just quickly introduce yourself and your channel to everyone? Because we already introduced Mike and Jacob.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm DeadmanAnimations. I make spooky propaganda. I'm here for the conversation about just how boys are socialized to be predators, and it sucks. It's really bad. And like not too much about my channel. I'd rather just have this conversation because people can just like look me up. But no, I think this is a very important conversation because I don't know what was already said, but one thing I think is really important in this conversation is just understanding violence, because I feel like that's a very big part of patriarchy. And it's not just kind of the mythology of violence that I think a lot of men are fed, which is you have like just like the very standard idea. You have an action movie, you have the guy who is good, he does violence, justified, you have a reason why. But then on the other side, he's killing mostly men. And you have this notion of like bad men like who are the bad men, who are people who are acceptable to be killed. And it feeds this idea for men as not only like people to be violent as an expression of like personhood, but the idea that simultaneously they're also extremely expendable because of that nature of that violent system. Which is why a lot of men, beyond just like being stoic and not be able to show their emotions or not really even develop emotional intelligence, like they really will cling to a kind of death drive because of patriarchy, and will really take those ideas to their extremes. So I think that's really important to highlight just how much violence is basically taught to men as a way of expressing self more than anything else.
And you must have noticed, isn't it so strange how like the men's rights movement will look at the expendability of men and be like, see, this is evidence that like, you know, men are oppressed. And it's like, well, hold on. Why is we're doing that to ourselves, buddy? Like that isn't because of women.
Exactly.
Anyway, yeah.
So just to catch up to speed, we were just talking a bit about the first couple discussion questions of how were you taught to think about sex growing up, and then also how did your peers talk about sexuality and women amongst themselves? So Mike and Jacob shared how they were kind of taught to think about sex. Mike comes from a really conservative evangelical background, and Jacob just had kind of a normal upbringing, that just did not involve any adequate sex education. And we were just kind of talking now about kind of that shift that happens around like grade 7, 8, 9, where you start to, I guess, learn a lot about sex from your peer group. And we're just talking about like how did your peers talk about sex and women? But yeah, you can jump in from whatever point of that you'd like. We still need to hear from Mike on how his peers talked about women and sex as well at that age. Yeah.
So I'll go over the first one. So I think very kind of obvious, but like still an important point. I'm coming from like a colonized perspective. I'm a new African person living in America, or Black American, as most people would say. And my upbringing around sex came from that kind of Baptist Christian perspective, where like sex exists, but it's like, and I think this is interesting in Christian culture, where you can joke about sex in a very distant kind of way, but sex is almost reserved exclusively for marriage as a concept. And for me, and there may have been some parts of me being like neurodivergent and like thinking of things differently, but when I was young, like I really did think for like a good long time into like my teenage years that like the only way I was going to have sex was to be married. So I treated relationships as if I'm dating you, we're gonna get married type of thing. So I had to like really like mythologize, or I didn't have to, but I like mythologize these relationships as much more critical and important, rather than like casual and just like you're just trying to find out like whether you vibe with someone or not. And so like that's already unhealthy. But then like raised around sex, I literally did not meaningfully learn anything about sex outside of just like a textbook. Here's the penis, here's the vagina, and you're gonna go through puberty, and that's like it. And so coming from like a perspective of having social anxieties as well as ADHD meant that like what sex actually is, the idea about relationships, consent, trust, and actually like getting to know a person, getting to know yourself, your body, like stuff like that, none of that translated. And the only kind of like warning you get is no means no, which means like unless someone specifically says no in a very specific kind of way, like consent otherwise is like non-existent as a concept. And so like for me, my upbringing was very, very much around sex as a weird taboo that young me kind of discovered like through pornography, through all these venues that men are kind of allowed to discover sex, which is all fantasy, deeply patriarchal, and in my case, like extremely racialized. Like one thing about that was the idea that like the very obvious like joke about a Black person's genitals was something I was exposed at during a period of time where like I didn't even think of myself like that, like as a person. I didn't think of my body that kind of way. And just the kind of like weird anxiety that was kind of pushed upon me because people thought, oh, I'm going to say this black joke where the punchline is this person has giant genitals and this is just a normal thing about black men. And then all of a sudden, like, I'm existentially worried about my genital size when prior, like, my genitals were just my genitals. They were a part of my body, but now they're separated from my body as something that, like, lives up to expectations outside of myself. So that was, like, a way I was socialized. And that was a lot of stuff I had to unpack in my, like early 20s, or some in my teenage years, but I was, like, way too depressed to do anything. So, like, it was mostly, like, my early 20s and kind of, like, my mid-20s that I really had to, like, seriously unlearn a lot of this stuff because it made me very, very miserable.
Yeah, but, there's also a really pervasive sense that those jokes are somehow okay to make because they're like complimentary, you know, they're like it's like positive racism, like it's
which is weird because it's not I mean, even if we remove the racial component, the idea that like your penis length and size is like, oh yes, this is an important part about sex. Right. And then the minute you learn that, like, well, actually sex is like a understanding of what you want and what your partner wants. So like your genitals are just like a tool in sex. They're not like the most important thing about sex, especially when we live in an era where like sex toys are like highly advanced technologies. Like you can find so many different things to help with stuff like that. But because of like pride and just this culture that's so fixated on like, oh yes, my genitals as a weapon, not like as a part of me, but like as a weapon, means that like, oh yes, the biggest dick is important, even though that's not really. Could
we just acknowledge for a moment how big dicks are a male fantasy and a power fantasy? And like, this is known, right? Like this is not.
It's a part of that shift that you talked about, Jacob. Like that, like the unofficial shift when all of a sudden, like boys start talking or socialized into start talking about their penises, and like it's just this like almost unspoken expectation that bigger is better. You know, it's like the Slurpees at 7-Eleven.
Yeah,
you know?
It's because that's what porn depicts, right?
Yeah.
I think is a major reason for it. And then it, obviously there are ties to racist discourses dating back centuries as well.
I'd love to comment too on Deadman, something that you mentioned, because it's nice to hear someone else from the Southern Baptist / evangelical tradition who was not nice in the sense that I'm sorry that happened.
No. You came from the background, so it's like I get it. The same struggle.
The way that you said that about mythologizing relationships, oh my God, I was like, I wish that I could have expressed it that way, because that's exactly what happens. Is and I was somebody who I followed all the rules. I did not have any kind of sexual relationship until I was married. And it's absolutely true that you can't have normal human relationships. And then in your adult life, you're trying to figure out, well, how am I supposed to have normal relationships with anyone when I've always been almost trained to see any relationship with somebody that I'm attracted to is basically a potential marriage like that. And that's essentially the whole thing. And I heard a really interesting commentary on this from a podcaster a while back, talking about how that puts this pressure also on the way you look. Because if the only way you're going to get into a relationship with somebody is if you might marry them, and before that you can't have any kind of relationship, then you have to be very attractive in order to attract people into a relationship with you.
So to piggyback off of that, the other thing too is it's also a reference of class, because marriage is like a very specific class thing. And so like it puts it in the perspective where, and I think this, there's a video by Intellectual Media about like the creation of the teenager as like a concept. And it really highlights how marriage, with like how young people perceive it, is this thing that's very rooted in class. Because for people who can't afford marriage, or like marriage as a concept is very like not what they are taught to value as much as just kind of like doing their own independence thing. Like it makes it so that, especially if you're from Christian backgrounds, like marriage is the only way to like do the rite of passage and become a man or become like a person in the community, essentially.
Damn. That sounds pretty intense.
Well, and at that point too, women become basically property. And there is sort of a, I had a friend who expressed just shock and horror at an evangelical wedding, and he said it was almost like attending a virgin auction. You know, this idea that the emphasis on the bride's purity, like that the father of the bride actually got up and talked about his daughter's purity, and there was a ceremony where she like gave him her purity ring. And that's pretty disturbing, and it also reduces that relationship to this kind of very strange power dynamic as well, and it's like where the only role of a woman then is to be pure and then to offer their body to this man. And it's a very obviously very disturbing, but also those kinds of things get sort of deeply entrenched into your own thinking as a young man when that's what you're seeing all the time, that this is what relationships look like and this is what you're striving towards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight in the chat, Koch says big dicks hurt. And Nick says, yeah, can everyone stop trying to burst my cervix? Bigger is not necessarily better. So
but the pain, yeah, the pain inflicted is part of the fantasy, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's all that discourse around like, like beat it up, like beat up the pussy, like whatever, right? You're supposed to like smash it.
No, because that's the other thing too, because a lot of this is coming from porn. It's like one of the most obvious things about porn, and it's like it's sometimes talked about, but it's just that like the vast majority of porn is not consent based, because it's all this like fantasy where it's like, well, the assumption is it's consenting, but it's like if you just extrapolate most of it, it's just rape fantasy. And so like it makes it so like the way that boys are taught, like again, if pornography is going to be kind of the only space where sex in the way that is talked about, the idea that you're having an intimate relationship in your birthday suit with a person like this, the only place that talks about this is porn, because schools can't teach you it, or parent might get mad for some religious reasons. And like the best you get is like an anatomy book that's just like, here are genitals by themselves, isolated from the rest of the body, and like the experiences of sex. So that like now the only thing like a young boy, even like young non-men, would like get from this is that sex is this like extremely intense, like barely consensual thing that's supposed to be pleasurable.
Yeah, so I want to ask you all about your experiences with that as well. I'll just say also on the porn thing is that I've mentioned this before in a video, that what is depicted is also often like, it's not stuff that would actually feel good for someone with a vagina. It's something that like only might feel good for someone with a dick, and when that gets translated into the bedroom, it's really not great. But anyway, yeah, so I wanted to ask you all about that, about, how young you were when you were first exposed to porn, and how did that and just the broader male gaze in our society influence how you thought about sex, women, relationships, because we talk a lot about what it's like on this channel to grow up kind of on the other side of the male gaze and the implications of that for how we view ourselves and how we show up. But yeah, what was that like on the other end? And I'm sure that you probably had a lot of conversations as, young teens with other, with your friends that were like highly objectifying of women and sex, I imagine.
I was first exposed to porn, I think in grades. I mean, like, not that I didn't try to view it earlier, back when we were trying to view it on TV with friends, it was like you needed to be up at a certain time and a certain day, like 1 a.m. on like a Tuesday or like a Friday or whatever, and like channel surfing. And then there would be, just like static, but like occasionally you would see like a flash of a breast on the screen, and that would be like, oh my God. Right. And then there was a channel here in Canada called Showcase. I don't know if it's also in America. I don't really, but they had this show that was hosted by David Duchovny of all people, called Red Shoe Diaries. And it was like stories of like just like lusty stories basically, and it was softcore, and like the only nudity ever showed were tops. And that was, I remember being in like the Ottawa trip at school in like grade 6, and like we stayed up late to watch it because we knew that in we could get the channel in Ottawa or something like that. And then, but I also remember going to camp in grade, no, sorry, it wasn't grade. I was 14, and I snuck an issue of Penthouse in with my luggage into camp. And I did this because I wanted to bypass the awkward phase of like trying to make friends with everyone in my cabin. And I knew that if I snuck this magazine in, I would instantly be cool. Everyone would, oh, we lost Deadman.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like so that right away says something, right? Like that in order to be seen as cool, I needed to signal my misogyny, essentially. We didn't have the language for it back then, right? But that's what I was doing. And in doing so, I also contributed to the climate of misogyny. So yeah. Oh, we lost him again. All right. Well,
yeah, they'll be back.
Okay. Yeah. So that's like some early experiences with porn that I had, and I can get into more later, but
that's remarkably similar. I remember trying to watch the Playboy channel through the static, you know, as it, yeah,
we didn't get the Playboy channel.
Yeah, I was very young the first time I saw a Playboy, because my neighbor's dad had one or something, and and like young enough that I didn't even really know what I was looking at, which is a little bit disturbing, but I still knew well enough not to mention it to my parents. But then I used to house sit for a neighbor who had a subscription. And so I would just like, you know, I was like 12, 13 years old. I'd go over there and, you know, do what you do when you're 12 and 13 years old in the house full of Playboys. But the weird thing was, like, for me, that was loaded with tons of shame and guilt. Like, there was zero pleasure. I absolutely would never in a million years tell another person that I had done that, because I knew that it was like the worst thing I could possibly do. And then it was really bad because at the time I was what they call like a worship leader at my church, which is a thing. And so I used to, on Sunday mornings, I would play the music for the church a lot of the time. And I, like, maybe on a Saturday night, I'd be house sitting or taking care of the neighbor's dogs and looking at porn. And then the next morning, supposed to be going into church. And I just felt like I was the biggest fraud and like the world's hugest sinner. And I mean, to the point where I just like could barely get out of bed in the morning. Like, I was so racked with guilt. And like, you know, that feeling that you get like in your chest where you're like, you can barely talk because you feel so much like guilt and shame. And yeah, so it was a little bit different in the sense that I didn't want anybody to know. And that lasted right up until, see, this was all pre-internet. And then once the internet came around, I mean, thank goodness in a way, because now I think that was also tame compared to what I think kids are exposed to now. But once the internet came around, that was a different thing. And I didn't understand what an internet history was in the early days. And so my brother was like, dude, have you been looking at porn on the family computer? And I was like, oh shit. And he's like, I'm not going to tell mom and dad, but just stop doing it. And there's a whole bunch more to that story. But, you know, it's like definitely a different type of experience because I never would have talked about it. And my conversations about women were always like, you know, how like godly they were, or, you know, which, yeah, I know it sounds weird now, you know, how much I really wanted to pray with them at the next, you know, youth group. So, you know, it definitely like when it was time to hold hands to pray, you'd always be like strategically positioned, you know, to hold hands with your crush. Yeah, so
so funny.
I had a lot of those experiences, a lot of super horny summer camps, but absolutely there was no porn or anything because these were like ultra religious, and kinds of things. And so the conversations around women were just very, very, very different. But interestingly, no less patriarchal, because the whole assumption was that I would be leading a marriage, or I would be, somehow the head of a household at some point, and that played into the whole, the whole conversation. Women were largely viewed as obstacles or stumbling blocks or sin, and sex was this like sexuality and relationships were like this unfortunate necessity that some guys had because they just couldn't control themselves. If they were really good, they would control themselves so they could just focus on doing the Lord's work. But, some guys can't, so they have to get married. So the idea was that your wife is then your, I guess, sex toy or something, and then you can go on and doing the Lord's work. So, I mean, all very equally as fucked up, just in a very different way.
Yeah. My conversations about women had nothing to do with godliness, and they were all just about looks. Like everything is about, is she hot? How hot is she? Is she hotter than this person? Who's hotter? Like hot, everything. Like that's virtually all it was about, right? So also shitty, but in a different way.
Deadman, how about you?
Man, for me, it's like, okay, I was in the position of being a certain age physically, but mentally and emotionally, I was still like a kid. And so my track record with friends was I always had like more women friends than guy friends. And so once I hit that age where all of a sudden I'm supposed to look at women like sex things, it was like weird to me. But like I also was like in that socially anxious position of like, well, I don't want to be a boy forever. I want to be man, or whatever that is. But it's like none of it made sense to me. Like I didn't understand like what it was that you were supposed to do. And when it came to like my settings, I was kind of like a social butterfly in that like by the time I got to like high school, I was very solidly a band kid, but I was also like an art kid, and I knew popular kids. So like I got various different conversations about sex, and that like for me, it was something that I had to act like, oh yeah, I know about sex. Oh yeah, no, I know about the thing. Yeah, of course. Yeah, sex. Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, that person's a virgin. Oh, that sucks, man. That sucks. I'm not a virgin. Like it's a lot of that energy of just like performing a certain level of maturity when like realistically it's just like, I mean, I want a girlfriend, but like I also don't understand how to all of a sudden relate to women, even though like I've mostly had nothing but like women or girlfriends like throughout most of my childhood. Because again, like boys would always want to compete and do stuff like that. I'm like, can't we just be friends? Like I don't want to like race someone or like do like competitive things. When I was younger was just like the stakes of losing always seemed like really extra. And so I would rather do things that was just like, we can just do communal things and hang out. I just want to vibe. Like,
yeah, I was very much the same way when I was a kid, totally averse to sports, not because of fear of losing. I think I was just like, I guess it was a mix of fears. Anyway, I was just really averse to it. I think my my elementary school gym teacher essentially traumatized me. I like to this day, I have a fear of spherical projectiles as well as footballs. But like, yeah, I just wanted to vibe and chill. And like, and I remember at one point, because I never wanted to do sports in gym class. I always wanted to sit and read with my buddy who was like, a super avid reader who I'm still friends with to this day. And my gym teacher said that I had ADD, and he called for a meeting with my parents and the principal or something. And they told my parents that my parents told them that like, oh, well, he just doesn't like competition. And my gym teacher, apparently, I wasn't there for this part. I was sitting out in the hall or something while this was going on. But my gym teacher apparently was like freaking out, and he was like, the whole world is competition. Everything is competition. What do you mean he doesn't want to be a competitive? Like, and my parents actually just laughed at him, and then they said that I should be on Ritalin, and my parents just laughed and walked out of the room, and they were like, okay, we can go home, fuck these people. And like, thank God my parents were cool, right? Like yeah. But I, you know, if my parents were more normie, like I probably would have been medicated because of that, because of like not wanting to be like one of the typical like sporty boys, right?
Yeah. I was I was gonna say a minute ago, I was like, Deadman, are you looking at my notes?
Listen, you already said Baptist background. I'm like, look, same circles. Like but no, one thing I will say is that like I think my thing with competition was that like my dad he's the kind of person where he has his own baggage, and the way he parented was he did the like super stoic thing of just like having expectations on me, but he never wanted to be physically abusive, so he does the emotional abuse things of putting high standards on me. And so his thing was like, he was like my coach when I did like soccer as a kid. He was my coach when we did basketball. Like he was the kind of person, like whenever I did sports, he was the person who was like there to like encourage me to do things. So competition always wasn't a matter of my own personal success. It was always about like impressing him and living up to his standards. Something that like to this day, he's like, well, I mean, that's just parenting. I'm like, no, stop. That's not at all what happened. But like, I don't have like a fear of competition. It's just this idea that I was so ingrained to see it as like an existential victory versus like a personal thing.
Yeah, I believe this like spirit of hyper competition is also brought into the sexual realm in male like peer groups too. Like this is like my gym teacher's ideology is like directly imposed on like the ideas around sex.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Koch says, are gym teachers okay?
No, they are not.
No, they're not.
No, they're not. Teachers are not okay. No, I had an okay gym teacher who just let me chill and read in middle school, and he was cool. But his name, incidentally, was Mr. Strange. So
nice.
Nice.
Lived up to it.
Shout out to Mr. Strange.
Yeah, he was cool.
So I wanted to ask you about, and you've kind of been touching on it, but kind of like the pressures that you all felt around performing your masculinity when it came to sex, and how other men would like police you around that. And I'm sure you all have different things, because I'm sure like in the religious setting that would be different than in other settings. But yeah.
So I have a pretty funny story, because I was just like, no, that's pretty funny. So again, back to me being queer boy. So there was a song, what I think it was Ladies Night by Jungle, not Jungle. Who sings that song? But no, the song was like Ladies Night, and I was just like obsessed with that song as a kid. I was just always singing it. And this one guy who was like in band was like, "Don't sing that song." And it's just like, wait, why? I love that song. And he's like, he didn't say it explicitly, but because it was like that early 2000s energy, it was just like, cause it's gay energy. And that I feel like that's a very big part of policing. It may not be as true nowadays. I feel like it still is, but just the idea that like policing any type of queer behavior as a man and really making sure you stay on the straight path is very much a thing. Or just the idea that like you may say like the saying of like, oh, I don't have a problem with gays, I wish it wasn't in my face kind of thing. Like you could be gay, just like hide it. Like you're not supposed to be openly gay or queer in any way.
Yeah.
And that there's so much of that from the religious background, but honestly, like that got super reinforced just in the wider culture as well. Like there was definitely, especially like an early 90s kind of like, oh, the Seinfeld joke, not that there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
But this sort of like, this idea that you're not supposed to want any, like basically if you're a man, you're not supposed to want to explore anything related to sex or sexuality.
Yes.
You're supposed to want this very narrow thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then And then if you like kind of start deconstructing that, you're like, oh, like I have a prostate, and hey, guess what? You know, like there's a reason that you know, gay people have sex this way, because like it's cool. Like, like it's this whole thing, like somehow like your sexuality gets linked into these certain behaviors that you are and aren't allowed to do. And the whole world around you just tells you, well, you have to be this way. Unless you take on this label, and then you're that way, but then you're over there in that camp, and it's like this othering that goes on. And you know, growing up, there's nothing worse than being othered, right? So It's, you're just always looking for, well, okay, well, obviously, I guess I don't want that. So
not only is the type of sex we're meant to want to have narrowed, but the type of a person we're meant to have it with is extremely narrowed.
That's a great point.
So like body types that are outside what's seen as traditionally attractive are like you're not only shamed, you're shamed on so many levels, because like you're shamed for not having sex, right? You're shamed for being attracted to people who are outside of the what's seen as you know, traditionally attractive. You're shamed for like for talking, even like talking about sex in a way that isn't objectifying. You're shamed for that too. Like there's so much internal policing in male friend groups that it's like it's wild. It's just like I worked, my first job was at this video game store, and I have some incredible memories from them, but also like, you know, it was an extremely misogynistic environment, an extremely internal policing environment too. Like to the point where like I had one coworker who would just call me a virgin. He'd just be like, "Hey, virgin, bye, virgin, hi, virgin." I was like, "What?"
Oh my God.
And yeah, like he didn't do it all the time, but enough that it was like just very weird. And a lot of internal shame, horrifically misogynist things that I won't repeat were said in that environment too, like violently misogynist things. Like this is a group of people who like their idea of fun is after work going to like a bar, you know, going and watching MMA and getting really drunk. And like I went with them a few times just because like on an interpersonal level I liked talking to them, but like this environment that they went to as well was it took the misogynist and violent ideology and just amplified it. And like, you know, we like narrowly avoided fights for like no reason in these environments too. Like it was just really strange, and I hated it. but I felt like, you know, to be like one of the guys, I had to go with them, right?
Yeah. And then like I feel like, because especially like the misogynist spaces, because like I work warehouses, so I get the mixture of like grown men acting like teenagers and then teenagers acting like teenagers. And like it's not true of all of the ones I've worked at, but it's definitely like a boys' locker room energy. So like a few examples is like men making orgasm noises like women just cause, and seeing how loud they could get with it, just to like just to be guys, like just to like kind of humiliate women when they're not present, kind of thing. Definitely the conversations about just like any woman who is there who's just like not normally on the floor doing something, and then it's just like, oh, did you see her? Just how like sexual it gets and stuff like that. But just I feel like going back to like the narrow ideas of how you can have sex or what even sex is, like it's also just like a policing of like being a person. Like what, like going back to like the 90s, I feel like there really was, in a way that's like really funny now, and that people joke about, is just like doing anything a certain way was like, oh, is that gay? Like, oh, is that artist you listen to make you gay? And like,
does sitting in a certain way make you gay? Like,
are you washing your face? You know, that's kind of gay. Like just the idea that like being healthy was considered like somehow a queer thing. And so like all of those things I think really make male spaces, at least, this thing where the way sex is understood is something we're supposed to be very confident about, but also weirdly insecure about in that conflict. Like you can talk about these things, but it's never like seriously intimate. It's all very shallow, and it always has this idea that like women are necessary for sex as a like a vehicle to talk about sex, but they don't have agency in that notion of being sexual. They're just there as a like, I'm talking about sex. So what do women have? Boobs. Yes, boobs. So we're talking about boobs. And it's just like, it's never like a person. It's just a part of something that is I considered like woman or something.
Yeah.
And that's such a great point that you bring up too, because so much of the socialization around, at least mine, around being a young man with sex was that sex is supposed to feel good. That's it. It's supposed to feel good for you. And so the idea of exploring any kind of like emotions that might go along with that, any kind of connection that might happen with that is almost a little bit like, well, like you just said, it's almost like, oh, well, that's gay if you
Yeah, literally.
yeah. And it's like, okay, so, I'm attracted to women, but apparently I am gay because I attach a lot of, emotional significance to this interaction. That's fine, but it's also kind of weird that we have to call it that. But I think that there's just this shaming that goes along with it, like the self-policing that you mentioned, Mexie, or the policing that goes along with, well, you're not supposed to have feelings, or this isn't supposed to be a layered thing, or sex isn't about communication or mutual pleasure or fun or exploration. It's just about you getting a certain feeling, and then, largely through heterosexual penetrative sex, and that's it. And then you have that feeling, and then it's done,
Yeah.
and that's the whole thing. And there's no relationship, there's no emotion, there's no depth, there's no complexity. Yeah.
In my experience, like it's almost like the importance of sex is from what I'm hearing, though I may be wrong, is it's kind of downplayed compared to other aspects of life, right? Like whereas in my environment, it was not downplayed. It was like the complete opposite. I remember one conversation I had with a couple of my coworkers, and one of them like frequented strip clubs too. And I've never been to one, and I always thought they were like super sleazy. So and also I grew up watching The Sopranos, which makes them look even worse. So, but yeah. And I told them, like, guys, there's more to life than having sex. And they looked at me and they just laughed at my face. They just laughed at me. And I was like, is this a way to live? Wait a minute. Like the very idea that there's more to life than sexual conquest is like absurd to you. Like, are you saying you like don't get enjoyment out of anything else? Like you don't, or maybe you just feel like you have to signal that you don't get enjoyment out of anything else to like make yourself feel like, put yourself higher up in some sort of patriarchal hierarchy. But I could never really wrap my head around it. Yeah, but that was the environment I grew up in, where it was like the most important aspect of being a guy is sexual conquest.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you just said conquest, right? Because what you were talking about, Mike, we talked about this in the last episode on hookup culture around how, a big part of constructing masculinity and, toxic masculinity is, men are supposed to want to fuck women. Like, you're supposed to want to fuck, but like catching feelings for a woman is like, oh my God, that's so weak. That's like, oh, she's gotten something over on you. You're pussy whipped, you're this, you're that. Like, having any kind of emotional connection with a woman is supposed to be like weak and pathetic. Like, you're just supposed to view them as sexual objects for conquest. Which I think really reinforces, not only rape culture, but, just the hierarchies that we see under patriarchy, right? Like, it reinforces that hierarchy because you're othering somebody as an object, which obviously on a societal level, contributes to hierarchical oppression, right?
Yeah. I'd love to actually share a quick anecdote on that note. Because I think it's a really, really important point that needs to be made. And not to be too transparent, but, I was married when I was 21. That was my only relationship. And then I just recently was divorced a couple years ago. And upon my divorce, the first reaction that I got from most male friends, and this is as an adult male, like people who have mortgages, this type of thing, is like, oh, good, now you can go fuck a lot of women. That's the first reaction. It's like, well, now you can go out, now you can set up a Tinder profile, now you can go do all this. And I'm kind of like, that's not like like, you know, I'm kind of devastated, not about the divorce, but, you know, about like other stuff. Like, I'm kind of devastated about the, like, you know, that's not the first thing I want to do. And then when I met my current partner, the whole thing was like, you know, again, from really, you know, otherwise intelligent human beings, males, telling me like, well, you know, don't get into anything too serious now, because now's your chance to go around and mess around and have sex with a lot of people. And I kind of felt like weirdly, you know, at my age, I felt even a little bit embarrassed. Like, I don't really want that. So like, but I'm like in this really fulfilling relationship. Like, isn't that
So
what?
I'm going to tell you right now, that's just them telling on themselves about their own sexuality.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, I think Mexie has said this on a sex stream before. It's like, but the idea that like, well, relationships are supposed to be like fun. And it's like this idea that like if they see marriage as this thing, it's like, oh man, I can only have sex with this one person. It's like that's not how that works. But okay. like people have open relationships, and even more to the point, like maybe you should communicate better. Maybe there's something that's missing. Maybe this isn't for you. Like but it doesn't translate. It's just like, oh, you're married? Well, time to put away my having sex life, and now I'm husband. And it's just like, no, stop it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because it takes the conquest piece out of it. And then at that point, it's like, oh, well, now all you can hope for is a fulfilling, loving relationship for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
How awful.
Yeah. That's like, I'm really happy right now, like happier than I've ever been. And you're telling me, oh, but don't get too serious. Like, that's not good advice.
Listen, you can only have happiness if it's coming out of your genitals. That's it. Everything else is a joke. It's not real.
Yeah, that's such a good point, though, that you're right, that it removes the conquest aspect of it. So therefore, it's like, well, now it's not exciting, because where's the conquest? Like, how can I feed my masculinity if I'm not, you know, if I'm not doing that, right?
Yeah, they're saying, well, now men don't think you're cool anymore. That's it,
but
right?
Also, because it'll also just mutate, because men will find a way to turn that conquest into other things. That's when you get like the sports dad who just becomes really obsessed with their sports, or like that, like the idea that men will really turn that conquest into something very small and inane that they can do now. Like the idea of a man cave being a place where they can like really just go and like kind of like refine their masculinity or whatever it is they need to do. And it's just like, yeah, no, it's like they don't abandon the conquest. They just have to turn it into something else. And in some cases, it can just outright just be cheating.
Yeah, you're totally right. And it's a dominator mentality. And it goes into the way that they abuse children. And I think, Deadman, you even made this point. It doesn't have to be physical abuse. This is psychological or emotional abuse that, you know, where young men are held, or boys are held to these weird standards that really ultimately stem from this kind of dominator model of like, okay, well, I can't control anything else in my life, so I'm going to control you, and I'm going to turn you into this type of person and live vicariously through you.
Exactly.
On that note, I'm reading The Mass Psychology of Fascism right now, and this is what it's about.
Yes.
So, won't get into it, but it's a really interesting book.
One thing I did want to mention, so like kind of just talking about like male peers and stuff like that. I think at least from my experience, growing up in like that era where like computers were kind of a lot more accessible, just the idea that like porn evolved to the point where like when I was a teenager, the idea that you had like a folder that was like hidden in other folders that just had like an archive of porn was like a thing, and that you would like share porn like to each other in a kind of way, like you would like have trading cards and be like, oh, what do you think of this? And it's like very explicit, and it's like, oh yeah, that. And it's like that idea of like not just objectifying women, but just kind of preparing yourself to see conquest of women in that context was very much something that's like a lot more not pervasive, but more accessible because of how the internet works and how the internet really is dominated by patriarchal notions of being in personhood.
Yeah, we didn't have that like for women, like that's not what we were doing. We weren't like sharing porn and stuff like that with each other or whatever. Yeah, so that's really interesting. So I wanted to ask about consent and, you know, how you were kind of socialized to think or not think about consent and maybe the implications that this had in, you know, your relationships with others.
I can go first. It's my
Sure.
Yeah. No. I actually mentioned this to Mexie before. Like on this topic, I literally did not know what consent was until I was in like my early 20s because of how like much it just was not taught as a concept. And like it was one of those things where like I mostly just decided, you know what? I'm not going to deal with relationships. And it just made me miserable because I was isolating myself from people. And so it's like finally learning what this was. And then on top of it being like, what does that say about the relationships I have in my life really helped me understand like not only like the shortcomings of like when I was younger, but also like my relationships with my parents and people in my like social circles at the time. I was like, oh, I didn't have these like as equal relationships as I would have thought because of what consent is and how like I later would come to understand it.
That's I can echo that same thing of never actually being taught consent. And I really interestingly absolutely never thought that consent was something that I could give also, which is an interesting idea that as a male, you're socialized to always want sex, always be down. And if you're not ready to go, there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's interesting, although maybe not really to the point. But one thing I will say, because I'm really hard on my religion, like I'm very much a critic of it. I will say that the one thing that my church didn't do horribly was they actually had really positive views around consent within marriage, also, which actually is kind of rare in Christian settings. And
Especially
so,
Baptist.
yes, exactly. Like the idea of marital consent would be like, what? But I had all the men in my life before I had sex. Again, we can deconstruct how weird it is that I had these conversations before I got married. But all the men in my life talked to me about the importance of consent and about the importance of the role that plays. And I was like, thinking back on my experience, I was like, wow, like something that wasn't completely fucked up. That's remarkable. So in that very narrow context of heterosexual marriage, I did learn a little bit, but as Deadman said, that wasn't until into my 20s. So never heard about that at school, didn't know that was a thing. And all of the media portrayals of sex are all that it's basically just women are gatekeepers, and any kind of model of consent is just whatever men have to do to get through the gate. That's
exactly.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember. I mean, the language of consent wasn't really brought up in definitely not in like phys ed. I think my mom's like a big feminist and a socialist, so she taught me some stuff, and but I don't even think we used the word consent. She was like, no means no, and like don't transgress on people's autonomy, and like women are like full human beings, like all that, right? I'm like, yeah, mom. And she's like, okay, good. Yeah. So yeah, I didn't start hearing about the language of consent, though I implicitly knew what it was until it like was thrust into the mainstream more recently. And actually I have good news on this. Since then, I've done some consent and health relationship like workshops with grade 9 boys here, and with an organization called Bad Subject, which is a really wicked organization in Toronto. And I'm happy to say that not only do they all know what consent was, like at least all the ones that I've talked to, and I did workshops in, I think, 3 or 4 classes. they're like, and there's like 12 and 13-year-old boys, right? They were like way more advanced than I was when I was their age, or we were like way well in advance. And they were, you know, they were even, it was actually cool. Like I was so pleasantly surprised. Like they were even when asking questions about consent. I remember one of them made a self-implicating gay, sort of like a self-implicating gay joke. And let me explain what I mean by that. Because it sounds bad on the surface, or I don't actually, it may not, but he said, okay, he pointed to his friend in the class and he's like, let's say I want to make out with my buddy here. And the whole class kind of chuckled, but like, he's like, how do I go about like saying like, hey, like, do you want to make out? And like when I was like 12 or 13, I would never dream of making a self-implicating joke like that, of being like, haha, like, what if I want to make out with my dude friend? But like they were already doing it at age like 12 or 13, and I thought that was a sign of progress. But anyway, I think the whole language of consent is that has been thrust into the mainstream as, from what I've seen anyway in my limited experience, really positive effects on kids.
Yeah, that's great, and I really like how you brought up, Mike, that that guys can consent or not consent too. That's something that is never really talked about.
I'll call complete. I've been transgressed upon. It's happened to me more than once, and yeah, it's a thing that can happen with guys. So
yeah.
Throwing that out there into the ether.
Yeah, and this idea that you're always supposed to be DTF. I mean, that's just a huge part of patriarchy as well. And Nicole says it's so exhausting to have to play gatekeeper. It keeps you from being able to truly consent because you never get to focus on what you want, only what you don't want. And you say yes out of fatigue. Koch asks, are guys sharing porn with their friends to prove their straightness? Like there's no danger of them coming out to their friends?
That's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely part of it. Yeah. It's a fear of being seen as gay, right?
Yeah.
Because that's like the worst thing ever. And in my view, homophobia is an extension of misogyny, because when you're gay, you're taking on feminine traits, which according to patriarchy are inherently inferior traits, and you don't want to be inferior.
Yeah, the betrayal.
It's also like, it's also a part of rape culture, because the simple fact is that, like, because queer people are so sexualized, it's a way of saying, like, not just I'm not someone who is like queer, but I'm someone who doesn't want to be sexualized in the way that I deeply understand that women are socialized, that non-men are sexualized.
Right. Yeah, great point.
Yeah, it's like they almost have that like self-awareness there. They're like, no, I'm the agent. I'm not the object. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to be the sexual object, right? So yeah, that's all super interesting. So I wanted to ask about, in what ways do you think your socialization might have been harmful to you? Like what experiences actually, or what it might have taken away from your experience? Mike, you were talking about the prostate, and I think that's a big thing that is taken away from cishet dudes, right? Because it's just like, that's actually one of the most, like, the prostate orgasm is compared to the woman's G-spot orgasm, or someone with the vagina's G-spot orgasm, which is like a full body kind of a thing. And so many cishet men will not go there because that's gay, right? So that's one thing. But just wondering other ways you might say that your socialization was harmful to both you and to others.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say on a lighter note, I would say that the best advice is like mess around with your prostate. Like it's very fun. But on a more serious note, I think that a lot of around that socialization, a lot of what happened, at least from my perspective, and I think this happens in a lot of more repressive or conservative or religious backgrounds, is that you don't view yourself as a sexual being, and you don't view yourself as having a sexuality. Also, this idea that if you're hetero, you don't have a sexuality is also kind of fucked up too. It's like, we all have a sexuality. Sexuality is a part of who we are. It plays different roles if you're asexual, or if you're bisexual, or if you're, you can have many different approaches to your sexuality, and it plays a different role in your life, and it might play a different role at different times. This is a big conversation we have with young people when we do a lot of our education work. But I think that that's probably the most harmful way, is that you close off whole parts of yourself, whole parts of your personality, whole parts of your way of being in the world. And it almost like forces you to only explore those things in private or in contexts where they were never meant to be explored alone. And it cuts you off from your humanity in a lot of ways. And I think this whole writ large, this whole kind of idea of predatory sexual conquest deprives men of the ability to and I'm stealing a lot here from Bell Hooks because that's really what she talks about in The Will to Change, is just this idea that you're basically getting left out of all these amazing experiences in life and experiencing love and experiencing what that looks like and feels like in all these different contexts, because that's something that's just reserved for one particular narrow circumstance. So I think that really it kills a lot of us. And I think even, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but this idea that even like being healthy is somehow not masculine, or caring about, caring about your body, caring about what you put into it, caring about love, caring about affection, needing to be in tender relationships, that like, if you're missing out on all that, you're missing out on such a rich part of the human experience. So, super happy to get to discover that stuff. And it's like really exciting, but it is something that I think a lot of men or socialized men are deprived of.
On the topic of men's health, though, this is something that I talk about frequently when I speak to kids, is like the one thing that men are allowed to that's associated with men's health, that it's okay to talk about, is sex. There's this idea that like you need to have an active sex life in order to maintain optimal bodily health if you're a man.
Yes.
And masturbation doesn't count for some reason, right? For some reason, you need to be like doing like penetrative sex in order to maintain bodily health, and that this is normal and natural, and that if you're not doing this, you're somehow unhealthy or your body will deteriorate somehow if you're not doing it. And I think when I've spoken to kids, none of them had apparently been exposed to this idea, but when I was growing up, this is very much a thing. And I think it was one of the most dangerous things that we teach people, particularly young boys, is that like sex is needed to maintain not just bodily health but mental health as well. And if you read these, that is a thing. Can you believe that? That if you read these some of the manifestos of people who carry out misogynist terrorist attacks, they say like, oh, well, of course I became this kind of person. I was deprived of sex. So yes, I became mentally ill because I'm supposed to have sex and I'm not having sex. So like this fucked with my head. And this has nothing. This is like the least scientific thing out there. But it's such a pervasive idea that the power of this ideology can take that kind of hold on people. I actually wanted to address a couple things in the chat. Okay. Menica asked, sorry, can I go up?
Yeah, just let me do it.
Okay. Menica asked, what are some feminine traits? So like traits of patriarchy codes as feminine? Yeah, I was talking here about things like emotionality and softness, and also being in the position of someone who is penetrated, but that in itself is obviously a really problematic idea. Like, why don't we conceive of this as like one person engulfing another, right? And I think so. There was another comment.
I just wanted to show this because it's really disturbing. I remember my high school sex ed teacher literally telling us men are always ready.
That's tied to this idea that like you need sex to be healthy. And like normal, healthy male sexuality is this idea of like always being ready, always being DTF.
And
I also wanted to bring this up just because
I was going to mention, if no one else says blue balls right now, we need to talk about this.
Because I wanted to mention that because like this is obviously a harmful thing that's taught to young men, but it was also taught to me when I was younger, right? So like as young women, we were taught like if a man gets horny in your presence, like it's your duty to help him get off, because if he gets blue balls, that's just the worst thing that could happen. And it's just so healthy and so unhealthy for him and so painful for him. And that just can't happen. Right. So like, you gotta, just like do whatever it takes to address that, lest they get like, that was like a huge thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is all just bullshit. I mean, everybody watching this already knows this, but yeah, it's just that one's shocking to me. That one comes up always in sex ed class, less and less now, but in some of those sex ed classes, and whenever it gets brought up, I'm always like, you got two options: your right hand and your left hand. Like this is not science, guys.
Yeah.
Of all the things that don't exist, blue balls doesn't exist the most. Can we just?
Yeah. And then next, that I think what Jacob is talking about right now also links to a lack of boundaries and consent for men. Don't ever consider what you need or have limits around what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, also, sorry. I think also that's linked in, the boundaries thing is also linked in even to the idea of like feminine traits, like this idea that having boundaries is a feminine thing, or like being emotionally distraught, I mean, like for myself, like when I don't want to have sex, it's like when I'm really emotionally distraught, or like something's really bothering me, that's how it's somehow feminine, or that, or the idea of like crying, or the idea of being like, like having sexual relationship with your partner, having some kind of intercourse, and then afterwards, like, crying, but not out of not from a place of harm, but from a place of like really feeling a lot of happiness and a lot of joy in that experience, that's somehow like, weird or feminine or something, because it's not based around this dominator model.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like that's like, we should be crying at beautiful things, or enjoying the full depth and range of emotions that go along with that.
Yeah, it makes me sad, because it makes me think that, like, yeah, as you said, like so many men are just really cut off from like the full experience, like the full breadth and depth of human experience, right? The full breadth and depth of like an embodied connection that you can have with somebody, and like embodied pleasure that you can share together. And like, that can be like cosmic, like that can be just like so powerful, right? So I'm conscious of the time. I know, Mike, you have to head out in about 15 minutes. So I wanted to ask you all how you started to kind of unravel your conditioning, and kind of the work that you've had to do, and maybe how you kind of went about that to do the internal work and maybe the external work of, divesting from the patriarchy, the male gaze, and the broader kind of rape culture.
I'm going to give an answer that I hate when most men give this, and so please forgive me in advance for what I'm about to say. But for me, being the father of children, but in particularly, I'm the father of two daughters, and I hate it when men say that, as if like somehow, women begin to exist when you like give, when you have offspring that are female. But I think one of the things for me was very early on, just being really conscious of the messaging that they get from a very early age, before they're even born into the world, because patriarchy starts before that socialization begins before that child is born, which is something that was driven home to me in that experience. It was something that increased my awareness, for sure. But I think one of the best things for me, like, it was just doing a lot of reading. I remember reading like Rebecca Solnit, for example. The first time I read Bell Hooks, this was a late in life discovery. And a lot of this too, a lot of the healing for me just came in having a partner who is, just so tuned in to those messages and able to have those conversations. And I think it's Tony Porter, who I really like. He's kind of an educator and speaker. I saw him on Justin Baldoni's Man Enough series on YouTube. But he talks about calling in instead of calling out, like calling men in instead of calling them out. And I think that for me, being around other men who will call you into that, I haven't found those men yet. I'm assuming they're out there somewhere. But starting with just in relationships, really being willing. I think for me, it's like a willingness to confront that. And honestly, like the number one thing that has been helpful for me is just like crying a lot. Like I feel like I'm on this one-man crusade to like make up for all the men who can't cry by doing it all myself.
I love that.
but I think that like a lot of that was like allowing myself to do stuff and feel stuff and say stuff. And again, for me, that's in the context of having a really loving and tender partner, but also just being like actually refusing to be in relationships that are shitty, and saying to like other men, just being like, I don't really like being friends with you because you're kind of an asshole. And like, we can't, there's no like tenderness in this relationship. There's no love. And so I think also just, you know, the friendships I do have, I think of like, so for the first time in my life, as a man, I told another friend of mine that I love him, and it was the most powerful thing. And it was, actually, I got to give him credit. He was so shout out to my friend Andrew, because he was the one who's like, I love you. And it wasn't that weird, like, I love you, brother, you know, or that kind of like, you know, I'm gonna, you know, we're hugging you, but I'm hitting you in the back at the same time. Like it was like like affectionate. And I was like, this just unlocked like all these things in our relationship that we were able to do that. So I feel like just bringing a lot more love into the conversation and a lot more love into relationships has been incredibly powerful, because you can't have, if you have like a lot of love, you can't have patriarchy. Like it doesn't work if you have that. So, yeah.
I love that. I love that so much.
Yeah, I love that too. That's great. I'm really blessed in that I had my one of my closest friends growing up. I think we said I love you to each other when we were like 16 or 17 or something. So that was cool. And then I was really fortunate to have like amazing friends later on in life too, who are open and like we say I love you to each other. And yeah, I count myself very blessed and lucky that I'm able to have these like really strong like tender relationships with guy friends. And yeah, the work I did, I think at some point, because I did like watch quite a bit of porn in like my you know, teens and like early 20s to my mid 20s. And then what it was, now that I think about it more, not that I haven't been thinking about it, but we were talking about my job earlier, where it was a really misogynistic environment, and it was leaving that environment that was really helpful for me. And then realizing like, I'm like, when I look at women or non-men, I think like, I'm like, why is the first thing that comes to my head like, I wonder what they look like naked? Isn't that really fucked up? And then I'm like, yeah, that is fucked up. And then so it was leaving that environment and basically diminish, like lowering the amount of my porn consumption like over time, to the point where it's now virtually non-existent. I mean, but it is like it is kind of like it is akin to an addiction in many ways, and like because of that there are relapses. But I've done like a lot of work to remove that from my life, basically. And I continue to do the work. It's ongoing.
Deadman, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm just I'm just listening. I'm sorry. No. For me, man, it's like different things. I feel like me finally going to therapy in like, I think my earlier mid 20s helped. As a colonized person, I think the one thing was just kind of unpacking like kind of the spaces I was in, and kind of like what more intimate relationships meant. Just because some of the people I was friends with, like it was more like we grew up together. Like we went to the same high school, we went to the same junior high and stuff like that. But like once we like left that like kind of bastion of like this social setting of the suburbs, like it was just very clear that like we were from two very different classes, and I just like from where I couldn't keep up with them. And like, for me, that really like made me feel like I didn't have this kind of value. And then like I met other people who, again, were colonized Black people like me, and like not only could we relate on certain things, but the fact that like with those people I had a lot closer, more intimate relationships to kind of help me have a value. Because I think that's another thing too, like even though I think like the way we kind of talk about sex is very like these relationships between people of like the opposite sex, which was important. I think one thing I've had consistency in my life is I always had very very understanding and loving and very very just very strong non-men friends and women in my life generally. But just the fact that like I grew to have more intimate relationships with men in my life, men who I can actually like be honest with, have more serious emotional conversations, kind of talking about my upbringing in that kind of way. Like that's helped me an awful lot. And I feel like a lot of the things, just kind of circling back to things that were said, I feel like in general, just the idea as a man, you can be like healthy in a way that's not just purely like, well, you got to exercise and be hot, or you gotta wear better, more expensive clothes. That way people will like you more. This thing where it's like you're trying to do something to impress others versus what will actually make you happy as a man, that isn't tied to some performance, some competition, some like ladder to achieve things, but just what actually makes you happy as a person, I think really help.
Well, I love that. Thank you all for sharing all of that. So the only thing I have left, and if anyone wants to bring anything else up that they haven't talked about so far, please do. But just what advice would you give, or what thoughts would you share with any young people today, specifically young people who are being socialized as boys and men? Yeah, what advice would you give them around how to navigate all this stuff?
Stop caring about what other people think of you, particularly other AMAB people, and you should care about what you think of you. My mom taught me that. Thanks, Mom.
I think the world needs more of your mom, Jacob.
She's pretty rad.
Yeah. I love that idea of like having that confidence, because I think that's so hard, because men are also just so much so socialized to worry about the group mentality as well. It's like the worst thing you can do is not fit in with that group. But yeah, I agree with that. And I think too, like just really calling out stuff. Like if stuff is making you if stuff is like doesn't feel right to you, then it's probably not right. And I just think of like the very few young people that I've been able to work with who really have taken those bold steps to call that stuff out when they see it. I think it's ended up creating some really rich environments for other young men, because like there are a lot of us out there, who are like, shutting down parts of ourselves, and we hate it, and we hate living in that kind of contradiction all the time. And so when you find those people, to build community and like latch onto those close friendships with other men as well, and cry. It's great.
Crying is good.
You should cry and have all the feelings.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No. There's a lot of different advice I would give. One, I think, because I've kind of come to this conclusion more recently, a very common phrase that people use when like talking about relationships or stuff is like, just be yourself. But like that doesn't translate for some people, because it's like that doesn't really mean anything. If you're like really depressed and someone says be yourself, it's like, well, I'm depressed, so I guess I'll just be depressed. So it's very much, it's like what most people are trying to say is that like you have to find out like what you value authentically as yourself. And so being yourself more or less means you have to like challenge who you're not. Like if someone says like, well, gender role says that men wear this, can you do the opposite thing? Can you put on a dress? Can you wear makeup? Can you do these certain things? And do you like them? You have to actually find out who you are. And that I think is a process is really important. You have to like really come to terms that like being yourself is a process of self-discovery. You have to actually go through this process of like understanding who you are, and also understanding that some of the things you think you are more or less expectations that have been put upon you to feel that you ought to be a certain way. So I think that's really important. And then especially for young boys, because I think like the biggest thing with young boys is just they need to be able to have not only the safety but the what's the word I'm looking for? Well, I'll just say safety because I can't think of the other word, like English. But the safety to just develop emotional intelligence, the ability to really like being able to connect to their emotions and being comfortable with those emotions. Because when it comes to relationships more than anything else, that is the most important skill. Like you can play into the patriarchal game and have money or big muscle or like whatever, like the thing. But the thing that's more important than all of those things and will last you a lifetime as far as a relationship is having emotional intelligence. Because it's not just about understanding yourself. It's about how you actually deeply understand other people, being able to understand what they're feeling, how to empathize where they're coming from. And that's like really, really important. So like being able to, as a young person, like, am I sad? Yes, I am sad. How do I express this sadness? Am I angry? Cool, I'm angry. How do I express this anger? Like, that's so much more important than just like trying to find like the magic method to make all the girls hot for you or whatever. Like, which is not the way you should look at relationships anyways. But for the most part, yeah, I just think that like people who are socialized to be boys, I feel like spend a lot of time living up to expectations in the way that women are. But like the caveat is that like there's like where I feel like people who are non-men are socialized to very much be in like a dangerous position because of how like boys are socialized. Boys are socialized to be that dangerous thing and also kind of be cool about it. They're very like boys are very much socialized to be okay with things that aren't okay as a way to express themselves. And that like I think feeds into a lot of like how rape culture exists as a like silent violence in that kind of way.
Yeah,
I think that's
absolutely. I also just want to say and this is what I tell the boys in the classrooms too, is that porn isn't real. Like it's you can't learn how to have sex from watching porn. In fact, you'll learn terrible really counterproductive things. An analogy I like to use is that porn is to sex what like a Jackie Chan fight scene is to real martial arts. It's just it's not, yeah, it's fake, it's nonsense. And yeah, you can only learn how to have sex through basically through doing it consensually in healthy ways. Yeah.
And to practice real great consent, like you really do have to view the other person as like an equal partner that's there for a mutual exchange, that you're both kind of like, you both need to be fully present for and really navigating that space. Because I find we've talked before about how a lot of experiences that we've had with men, it's like the men are just kind of like playing a script in their head, right? And it's something that they've probably seen in a movie or porn or whatever, and they're just like, oh, this is how it goes. First I do this, now I do this, now I flip them over, now I do this, and now we're done, right? And it's yeah, a lot of times it's like very objectifying and whatever. So in order to be there, you actually have to, like you were saying, Deadman, like you actually have to explore your emotional intelligence, because it takes a lot of vulnerability to actually be present in a sexual experience with someone else. Like, that's a very vulnerable place to be in. And I think that maybe because of the way that men are socialized around, like, you know, vulnerability being gay, that's part of this kind of like, oh, well, you can't have any emotion. You need to just like hit it and quit it and whatever. So you're not actually allowing yourself to be in that space in a vulnerable way. And then because of that, you're not getting that like extra layer of connection or like embodied pleasure, because you're just like, yeah, you're just playing a script in your head or whatever, and you're trying just not to feel anything, right? So anyway, I just really appreciate what all of you shared. I think that was really wonderful. I know, Mike, you have to run. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to say, but yeah.
I just realized that I had it on chat and not on comments, and I'm looking through all the comments, and I'm like, oh, hi, everyone. So sweet. Please go lovely. I wish I was reading these.
Yeah, I know. We got so many great comments. Thanks to everyone who said that they really loved the stream.
There was a comment about my scarf too. Thank you. It's called a kufiya, and it's from Gaza. If you're interested in getting one.
Yeah. Yeah, Nicole says men and women need to let go of the idea that men are supposed to know what they're doing always.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Most of us don't know what we're
They
doing.
don't.
Every interaction is different. That's
No.
it. Every interaction is different. Yeah, Nicole says, I think it leads to a lot of guys feeling afraid to stumble or ask questions, and girls expect to just kind of lay there and not be active participants and have agency. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, again, yeah, thank you all so much. I think the stream was awesome, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And yeah, I guess we'll see you all next month for the next stream, which we're not sure what it'll be yet, but we will let you know when we do.
Great.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.